They told you to love with everything you have, to be open, to be patient, to give freely and never keep score. They told you that if your heart was pure enough, the world would treat you gently, that kindness would protect you, that softness was strength. But Machiavelli never believed that. He didn't see love as salvation. He saw it as exposure, a gap in the armor, a blind spot in the strategy, a place where betrayal doesn't have to fight its way in. It's invited. Because the moment you lead with emotion, logic steps aside. And anyone who understands that can turn your feelings into leverage. Machiavelli understood this deeply. A man who depends on love alone will eventually be destroyed by it. Not because love is evil, but because love doesn't calculate, and the world always does. You love your family, your friends, your woman. You tell them everything. You forgive quickly. You assume loyalty because you feel it yourself. You think, if I would never hurt them, they would never hurt me. That's not the voice of a man. That's the voice of a child. And if Machiavelli were standing in front of you right now, he wouldn't scold you. He wouldn't shame you. He'd simply nod. Not because you're weak, but because you haven't learned yet. Here's the truth most men learn too late. The deepest wounds don't come from enemies. They come from the people you let closest. Familiarity dulls respect. Access kills gratitude. And unconditional patience slowly turns you into a tool. Not always out of cruelty. Sometimes it's just human nature. We exploit what's freely available. We stop valuing what never had to be earned. That's why something has to change. Becoming cold doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop loving without structure. You stop loving without standards. You stop loving without strategy. You love like a man who holds the reins, not like a man begging to be chosen. Because love without boundaries isn't connection. It's exposure. If you've ever been taken advantage of for being too good, if you've been abandoned for being too loyal, if you're always the one apologizing first, waiting longer, forgiving faster, then this is your moment. Not tomorrow, not when it happens again. Now. From this point forward, you do not love the same way. And if something in your chest tightened when you heard that, if part of you knows exactly what this is talking about, that's not anger. That's recognition. That's the moment the old version of you realizes his rules no longer work. This isn't just a video. It's a wake-up call Machiavelli issued centuries ago. In a world that profits from your softness, a man without strategy will be devoured by the very love he gives away too freely. And it never starts with a dramatic betrayal. It starts small. A sigh that lasts a second too long. A reply that comes a little later than usual. A look that once said, "I see you," now glazed over like fog on glass. And you don't notice. Because when you love deeply, you don't see clearly. You project. You paint over silence with hope. You explain away patterns you should be questioning, just to keep the fantasy alive. You don't want the truth. You want the comfort. And that's the first cost of love without strategy. It doesn't just blind you to betrayal. It blinds you to change. Machiavelli understood this with terrifying clarity. A man who builds his defense on love alone builds on sand. The moment you lead with emotion, you give the other person the power to change the rules without ever telling you the game has shifted. You stop calculating. You stop defending your position. You stop watching the board. And while you're busy being kind, they're making moves. They learn your forgiveness is automatic. Your presence is guaranteed. Your patience has no ceiling. So they push. They show up late. They stop saying thank you. They get irritated when you ask for space. Not because they hate you, but because they know they can. That's the Machiavellian principle most men refuse to accept. Familiarity doesn't breed love. It breeds entitlement. The more access someone has to you without cost, the less they value that access. Over time, you don't become their priority. You become their backup plan. Not because they're evil, but because you never required respect as the price of entry. Ask yourself this honestly. When was the last time you stayed quiet to avoid an argument? When you knew speaking up mattered? When was the last time you apologized, not because you were wrong, but because you were afraid of losing them? And how often did they do the same for you? That isn't love. That's erosion. It's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. And that's what Machiavelli feared more than enemies: blind devotion. Because betrayal doesn't need to kick your door down. It only needs you to stop locking it. Love without discipline makes you throw away the key. That's why structure matters. That's why boundaries matter. That's why terms matter, even in love. You must become the kind of man who can look someone he adores in the eye and still say, "I will not let you harm me," and stay. Unconditional love sounds beautiful in books. But in real life, it turns leaders into servants. Machiavelli never said stop loving. He said stop loving blindly. Stop handing swords to people just because they make you feel seen. Stop bleeding for anyone who flinches the moment you draw a line. Love is not a virtue when it has no discipline. It is not strength when it cannot say no. So the next time someone calls you cold for setting a boundary, remember this. They are not mourning the loss of love. They are mourning the death of their control. And in that moment, without rage, without revenge, you reclaim your power through clarity. That is the Machiavellian way. Not to harden your heart into stone, but to sharpen it into something that cannot be used against you. This is where the shift begins. You thought being open made you strong. You thought patience meant wisdom. You thought forgiving first meant growth. But no one told you this. You weren't leading. You were leaking. Leaking your voice. Leaking your standards. Leaking your identity. Quietly. Invisibly. One compromise at a time. And Machiavelli would have seen it instantly. Emotion, when left unchecked, becomes the leash they use to drag your power behind their pleasure. What looks like virtue on the surface often hides slow self-erasure underneath. You walked into life holding your soul like a fragile object, quietly asking the world to be gentle with it. You told yourself that if you were careful enough, patient enough, forgiving enough, people would meet you with the same care. But they didn't. Not because they were monsters. Not because they woke up wanting to hurt you. But because they learned something about you very quickly. You would always come back. You would always explain. You would always smooth things over, even when you didn't start the fire. You believed your silence was strength. But silence without consequence becomes permission. And in a Machiavellian world, permission, spoken or unspoken, is strategy. Once people map your patterns, respect begins to fade. They stop honoring your retreat. They stop earning your presence. They stop filtering their behavior because they already know the outcome. You forgive automatically. You stay instinctively. You give endlessly without checking whether you're receiving anything back. And when that pattern becomes clear, what you offer loses its weight. It turns into something they collect rather than cherish, like a resource that never runs out until it does. Let me ask you again, because this question matters more than you think. When was the last time you stayed quiet just to keep things calm? When was the last time you apologized just to prevent someone else from walking away? Now be honest. How often did they do the same for you? This isn't love. It's quiet disintegration. It's devotion that slowly dissolves your self-respect while convincing you it's noble. And that's exactly what Machiavelli warned against. Not enemies, not open conflict, but loyalty that can't see clearly. Because betrayal doesn't need force when you've already lowered the gate. Love without limits makes you forget where the door even was. That's why structure is non-negotiable. Boundaries are not optional. Terms are not cruelty. They are clarity. Even in love, especially in love, you must be the kind of man who can say, "I care about you, but I will not stay where I am being harmed." Unconditional love sounds poetic in novels, but in reality, it turns kings into laborers, leaders into servants. Machiavelli never told men to stop loving. He told them to stop loving without sight, to stop offering their throat to anyone who smiled warmly enough. To stop bleeding for people who recoil the moment a boundary appears. Love is not virtuous when it lacks discipline. It is not strength when it refuses to say no. And when someone reacts badly to your limits, understand this. They are not grieving your affection. They are grieving the loss of access. That realization alone changes everything. Because once you see it, you start to notice how slowly the erosion happened. It didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived with compromise. You said yes when you wanted to say no. You stayed silent when your chest was screaming to speak. You forgave before accountability ever showed up. And you told yourself you were just being the bigger person. Machiavelli would call it something else: unstrategic surrender. Here's the part most men never want to face. The moment you stop enforcing your boundaries, the game doesn't stop. It simply becomes one-sided. You think you're avoiding conflict. You think you're preserving peace. But silence in this context isn't peace. It's a vacuum. And vacuums never stay empty. They get filled by force. Your lack of resistance becomes the blueprint. They test your patience. Then they test your self-worth. And eventually, they rewrite the rules of the relationship without ever asking for your permission. You hesitate where you once stood firm. You justify what once felt unacceptable. You start whispering excuses like, "Maybe I'm overreacting," or "Maybe I should be more understanding." No, you don't need more understanding. You need your spine back. Because time does not heal disrespect. It hardens it. Every time you let it slide, you lay another brick. And one day you wake up trapped in a structure you helped build. Machiavelli warned us about this. When forgiveness is predictable, it gets used before it's appreciated. Let that settle. You were taught that love keeps no record, that counting costs makes you petty, that tracking imbalance makes you cold. But tell me this. What ruler survives without a ledger? What general wins wars without knowing his losses? You let guilt replace logic. You let emotion override reason. And every time you chose comfort over clarity, you paid for it by erasing yourself a little more. They collected your time, your silence, your emotional labor, and they paid nothing for it. Not gratitude, not reform, not respect. Until one day, you finally said no, and suddenly, you're the villain. You've changed. You're cold now. You're not who you used to be. Of course you changed. Growth always offends the people who benefited from your stagnation. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you that made their life easier by making yours smaller. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. A man respected for his firmness is remembered long after the agreeable man is forgotten. You don't need to be feared like a tyrant. You need to be respected like a man who means what he says. Consistency is power, and power is not something you negotiate. It's something you hold, or you lose. So stop apologizing for the walls you built after years of being trampled. Those walls are not cruelty. They are clarity. They say, you can still knock. But you do not walk through without permission, because the moment consequences disappear, behavior deteriorates. Without a filter, there is no bottom. People begin to expect loyalty without reciprocity, access without qualification, forgiveness without change. And when you finally withdraw, they don't call it correction. They call it betrayal. But they're not mourning love. They're mourning advantage, the free emotional labor, the convenient silence. The man who didn't know how to say no. That man is gone. Now you don't chase. You don't over-explain. You don't beg to be understood. You return to the board. Not with anger, but with rules. Let them talk. Let them complain. Let them say you've changed. You're not here to be emotionally available on demand. You're here to be in command of your emotional availability. The game never ended. You just stopped playing blindly. Now you pick up your pieces. You study the board. And you remember something crucial. You were never the piece. You were always the player. They told you to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to not rock the boat, to smile through discomfort and let things slide in the name of harmony. But no one ever told you the cost of that peace. No one warned you what it would take from your spine, your voice, your sense of self, because what they called peace was never peace. It was submission. It was the slow suffocation of your standards, your identity shaved down one quiet silence at a time. And you thought you were strong for swallowing your truth. You thought you were kind for forgiving what kept cutting you. You thought you were noble for always being the one who moved on. Machiavelli would have shaken his head, not because you were weak, but because he understood what happens to a man who trades clarity for comfort. There is no peace where respect is absent. There is no loyalty where consequences are forgotten. You stayed quiet when your needs were dismissed. You forgave betrayal not because it was repaired, but because holding your ground felt heavier than letting it go. You kept smiling while bleeding. And what did that earn you? A seat at a table where everyone eats from your plate, but no one asks if you're hungry. You became the reliable one, the strong one, the man people unload on, lean on, step on, and circle back to when it's convenient. You became useful, and the exact moment you finally said, "Enough," they looked at you like strangers. You've changed. You're so cold now. What happened to you? But let's be honest. You didn't change. You just stopped dying for their comfort. And if that made them uncomfortable, that's not your problem. Let them sit in it, because the peace you were protecting was never yours. It was their comfort in your compliance, their ease in your self-erasure. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you who tolerated everything and asked for nothing. And now that version is gone. So yes, they'll call you distant. Yes, they'll call you harsh. Yes, they'll say you're not who you used to be. Good, because the man you used to be was disappearing behind a smile, burning himself just to keep others warm, and calling it virtue. But what if love isn't always soft? What if real love draws a line and dares people not to cross it? What if strength isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by how clearly you can say, "This stops here"? That's not bitterness. That's boundaries. And boundaries are what separate men who are respected from men who are remembered only for their availability. So ask yourself something, and don't rush the answer. How many times have you apologized for making someone uncomfortable by finally honoring your truth? How many times have you lowered your tone, shrunk your presence, softened your stance because you were taught that peace is always better than tension? And what did it buy you? Did they respect you more? Did they change? Did they protect you the way you protected them? Or did they just keep taking and call it normal? Because if the only way to keep peace is to go to war with yourself, that's not peace. That's performance, and every performance has a breaking point. This is yours. From now on, let your peace be expensive. Let your love be filtered. Let your silence be earned, not assumed. The people who truly care about you will lean into your clarity. They won't run from it. They won't weaponize your growth. They won't mourn the loss of a version of you that made their life easier while yours fell apart. Let the others leave. Let them whisper. Let them say you've changed. You have, and you should be proud of that. From this point forward, you don't confuse stillness with safety. You don't confuse compliance with connection. You don't confuse patience with purpose. You are not here to be agreeable. You are here to be real. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself. Draw your lines. Speak your truth. Watch who gets uncomfortable when you stop shrinking. Because the ones who disappear were never in love with you. They were in love with the power they had over you. And that power is gone. This man standing here now, the one in your shoes, he is no longer afraid of conflict. He is no longer performing for approval. He is no longer holding the ship together while it sinks beneath his feet. He has drawn the line, and behind that line, there is peace. Real peace. Not silence, not avoidance, not suffering hidden behind a smile. Peace that costs nothing you were never meant to give. They taught you to love without fear, to give without limits, to forgive without hesitation, to trust without question. They called that strength. They said that was what made a man good, admirable, worthy. But Machiavelli would have laughed. Not because he despised love, but because he understood something they never told you. Fearless love isn't noble. It's naive. Real strength, the kind that lasts, is never blind. It's never reckless. It watches. It measures. It protects itself while it gives. You were sold a beautiful lie, wrapped in poetry, soaked in guilt. Be soft. Always return. Never withhold your heart. Never walk away. And you listened. You said yes when every part of you wanted to scream no. You stayed when your spirit was already unraveling. You kept showing up even when your soul was limping. And they told you that was love. But here's what Machiavelli knew, and what no one ever told you. When a man loves without fear, he becomes easy to control. He becomes pliable, predictable, soft clay in hands that don't know how to hold him. And in a world ruled by perception, predictability is death. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. How many times have you betrayed yourself just to be understood? How many times have you silenced your instincts just to keep someone else calm? How many times did you swallow your standards because you were afraid of being called difficult, selfish, or cold? That isn't love. That's emotional conditioning, a system designed to keep good men in cages built from their own guilt. Because when you love without fear, you forget to protect yourself. You give and give until you slowly disappear. And when you vanish into your giving, they don't stop you. They applaud. They call you empathetic, reliable, strong. And they keep taking until you are no longer a man, but a function, a resource. Something they turn on when they need warmth and shut off when they're full. And when you finally run dry, they don't mourn you. They replace you. Fearless love doesn't make you powerful. It makes you disposable. Machiavelli saw this pattern everywhere. Kings who couldn't walk away were slaughtered. Generals who fought for loyalty without leverage were betrayed. Men who worshipped instead of ruled were erased. Because when you give your heart without guardrails, without standards, without consequence, you are not offering love. You are offering power, and power given freely is rarely returned intact. Here's the truth no one dares to say out loud. You are supposed to be afraid. Afraid of loving the wrong person for too long. Afraid of trading your values for validation. Afraid of becoming the man who gives so much he forgets what it feels like to receive. That fear isn't weakness. It's instinct. Ignoring it, that's the real danger. Because what good is being held at night if you have to kill your dignity to be there? What good is being loved if that love survives only by silencing your spine? Real love, the kind that doesn't rot, is not fearless. It's watchful. It's structured. It's earned. It protects as much as it gives. So if they call you cold for setting standards, let them. If they call you distant for enforcing your worth, let them. If they say you're hard to love because you won't kneel, let them. You're not here to be worshipped. You're not here to prove how soft you can be. You're here to build something unshakable. Not just connection, respect. Not just romance, stability. And if that means you walk alone for a while, then walk like a king. Because Machiavelli would ask you this quietly, directly. Is the throne you're trying to build in someone else's heart worth the crown you're burning on your own head? So no, you don't need to love fearlessly. You need to love wisely, with caution, with clarity. You need to be the kind of man who can say, I will give you my heart, but I will never give you the power to destroy it without consequence. That's not cold. That's calculated. And in a world that feeds on soft men, calculation is survival. This is the death of the man you used to be. The one who led with emotion, who tried to be liked, who believed goodness was enough. He's gone. Because he was never leading. He was leaking patience, forgiveness, identity, trading pieces of himself for approval. And no one saved him. No one said, you're giving too much. No one said, you're breaking behind that smile. They clapped, they praised, they used him. They called it love. And he kept showing up until there was nothing left to show. But you are not that man anymore. Because now you understand something Machiavelli knew centuries ago. Power does not belong to the kindest man in the room. It belongs to the most precise one. The man who knows exactly what he allows, exactly when he withdraws, exactly where the line is, and never needs to explain it. That is authority. And this is the shift. You stop justifying your standards. You stop apologizing for your silence. You stop defending your distance. You don't raise your voice. You remove your presence, not out of pettiness, but principle. Because the man who moves in silence doesn't just spark curiosity, he commands respect. Now, when someone crosses your line, you don't negotiate. You don't argue. You don't plead. You let absence teach the lesson your words never could. And when they ask, why are you acting different? You don't over-explain. You don't soften it. You say, I recalibrated, and that's it. Authority doesn't explain itself, it acts. This is your final transition, from the man who needed to be heard to the man who is heard without speaking, from the man who reacted emotionally to the man who responds strategically, from the man who overgave to the man who now observes, who filters access, who watches who earns their way closer. Every boundary you draw from here on is not an invitation to debate. It is a threshold. Those who belong will rise to meet it. The rest will fall away, and you will not chase them. Because chasing is what emotional men do. You are no longer emotional. You are exact. You no longer define yourself by how much you endure. You define yourself by what you refuse to tolerate. You don't demand apologies. You demand alignment. You don't plead for understanding. You reward growth with presence. Your care becomes expensive, your loyalty conditional. Not out of cruelty, but out of value. Because what is sacred must be guarded, or it will be gutted. Machiavelli never preached cruelty. He preached restraint, precision, strategic silence. He didn't burn bridges. He watched who was willing to swim the moat when the gate didn't open. Now you build your moat. You raise your standards. You rebuild the kingdom of your peace with brick, not hope, with boundaries, not blind trust. And when they say you've changed, you smile, because that was always the point. You are no longer the man who gives everything away just to be chosen. You are the man who finally chose himself. And from this point forward, every move you make is no longer a reaction. It is a signal. You stopped explaining your boundaries. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. That alone changes the entire dynamic. Because the moment you stop chasing approval, something unsettling happens to the people who relied on your availability. They feel the shift before they can name it. The tone changes. The pressure increases. The guilt gets louder. They ask what happened to you. You didn't become cruel. You didn't become bitter. You didn't become closed. You became selective. And selection terrifies people who are used to free access. They start telling stories about you, that you're distant, that you're cold, that you've changed. They frame your boundaries as betrayal because it's easier than admitting they were comfortable crossing them. But listen carefully. People don't panic when you grow. They panic when your growth removes their advantage. They weren't attached to you. They were attached to the version of you who overextended, overgave, overexplained. The man who made their life lighter by making his own heavier. That version of you is gone. And you don't need to announce it. You don't need closure speeches. You don't need dramatic exits. You simply stop playing the role. You stop being endlessly available. You stop rescuing emotions that aren't yours. You stop absorbing discomfort that doesn't belong to you. You let silence do the work. Because silence, when backed by standards, is not weakness. It is authority. This is where most men get it wrong. They think power is loud. They think dominance is aggression. They think control requires confrontation. Machiavelli knew better. True power doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain. It observes. It adjusts. It withdraws. And when necessary, it disappears. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Because absence is the only language some people understand. You don't threaten consequences, you become them. When your presence is no longer guaranteed, behavior changes. When access has a cost, respect returns. When silence follows disrespect, patterns reveal themselves. Watch what happens when you stop cushioning people from the impact of their actions. Some will rise. Some will apologize and adjust. Some will lean in and meet your standards. And others will expose themselves. They'll push harder, get louder, accuse you of being selfish, uncaring, unfair. They'll say you're withholding love, that you've changed the rules. No, you didn't change the rules. You started enforcing them. And that's what they can't handle. Because rules mean accountability. And accountability threatens entitlement. This is where your discernment sharpens. You stop asking, how do I explain myself better? And you start asking, how do they respond to limits? That tells you everything. People who care about you will respect your boundaries even when they don't benefit from them. People who only wanted access will fight your boundaries as if they're personal attacks. That distinction matters. You are no longer here to be endlessly understanding. You are here to be precise. Precision means you don't confuse intensity with intimacy. You don't mistake attachment for loyalty. You don't equate attention with love. You watch behavior. You watch consistency. You watch what happens when you say no. And you let that information guide your decisions, not emotion, not guilt, not fear of being alone. Because loneliness is temporary. Self-betrayal lasts much longer. You've already lived that version of hell. The nights where you replay conversations in your head. The mornings where you wake up heavy without knowing why. The quiet resentment you swallowed and called maturity. That wasn't love. That was slow self-erasure. And the reason this transformation feels so intense isn't because you're becoming someone new. It's because you're finally stopping something that was killing you quietly. You are no longer trying to be safe. You are trying to be sovereign. Sovereignty means you decide what enters your space, who gets access to your time, who earns your emotional investment. It means your warmth is no longer assumed. It is invited. Your loyalty is no longer automatic. It is conditional. Not because you've become heartless, but because you finally understand your heart is not a public resource. It's a vault. And only those with the code get in. Now when someone crosses a line, you don't explode. You don't lecture. You don't over-explain. You note it. And you adjust your proximity accordingly. You let distance replace arguments. You let consistency replace promises. You let action speak louder than your hope ever did. This is discipline, and discipline is the foundation of power. Machiavelli didn't tell men to be cruel. He told them to be controlled, to stop letting emotion dictate strategy, to stop confusing kindness with vulnerability, because vulnerability without boundaries is exposure, and exposure invites exploitation. You don't stop loving. You refine it. You love through structure, through standards, through consequence. You give where it is reciprocated. You withdraw where it is taken for granted. And you don't apologize for that. Because love that requires self-destruction is not love. It is obedience. And you are done being obedient. This is the moment you stop confusing peace with silence. Stop mistaking endurance for strength. Stop calling self-sacrifice virtue. You don't need to prove how much you can take. You need to decide what you will no longer tolerate. That is maturity. That is leadership. That is the shift Machiavelli was pointing to centuries ago. You don't beg to be chosen. You don't compete for affection. You don't explain why you deserve respect. You expect it. And when it's not present, you move accordingly. Not dramatically, not angrily, precisely. Because the man who controls his responses controls the game. Now, when someone says, "You're not like you used to be," you don't defend yourself. You agree. Because the man you used to be was bleeding quietly. He was shrinking to maintain access. He was calling self-neglect loyalty. He's gone. And he's not coming back. This version of you doesn't wait to be seen. He commands presence. He doesn't love to prove his worth. He loves with sovereignty. He doesn't ask for peace. He builds it. He guards it. And he removes anyone who confuses kindness with weakness. So don't explain. Don't justify. Don't look back. Let them tell their stories, because they never loved the real you. They loved the version that kept breaking so they could stay comfortable. And that version is dead. What stands now is a man of boundaries, of restraint, of command. A man who understands that love without discipline is surrender, and surrender is not noble. If something inside you shifted while listening to this, if you felt tension release, anger clarify, resolve settle, that wasn't motivation. That was memory. You remembered who you were before you learned to shrink. This isn't inspiration. It's a warning. You were not born to be endlessly accommodating. You were born to master how love is given. You were not meant to wait. You were meant to set terms. You were not meant to bleed quietly and call it devotion. You were meant to lead with clarity. So choose. Either you remain soft, overgiving, apologetic, smiling through erosion and calling it love, or you become disciplined, calm, unavailable to disrespect, strategic with your heart, calculated, not cruel, because in a world that feeds on soft men, calculation is survival. This is the end of the old story. The man who leaked patience, the man who forgave without reform, the man who confused access with intimacy. He's gone, and the man replacing him doesn't ask for permission to exist fully. He sets the terms. Welcome back. Welcome forward. Your command has begun. And now, before you carry this forward, pause for a moment. Not to overthink it, not to analyze every word, but to recognize what just happened inside you, because something shifted. You didn't just hear ideas. You recognized patterns. You saw yourself, past versions, quiet compromises, moments you ignored because staying felt easier than standing. That awareness is irreversible. From here on, you won't unknow what you know. You won't be able to pretend silence is peace. You won't be able to confuse loyalty with self-erasure. And that's not a burden. That's freedom. Most men spend their lives trying to be chosen, trying to be understood, trying to be appreciated by people who never planned to meet them halfway. You don't have to do that anymore. Not because you've hardened your heart, but because you finally placed it behind structure. You are allowed to want depth without chaos. You are allowed to want love without leverage. You are allowed to walk away without explaining yourself to people who ignored your words when you spoke calmly. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. Clarity is what separates men who are drained from men who are respected. Clarity is what ends manipulation without confrontation. Clarity is what makes your presence felt even when you say nothing at all. From now on, your boundaries are not emotional reactions. They are policies. They are not punishments. They are filters. You don't raise your voice to be heard. You don't overgive to be valued. You don't stay where your standards are treated like inconveniences. You observe. You decide. You move. And when someone feels the distance and asks what changed, you don't argue. You don't justify. You don't soften the truth. You simply live differently. Because the strongest signal a man can send is consistency. Consistency between what he allows and what he claims to value. Consistency between his words and his withdrawals. Consistency between his standards and his actions. That's authority. And authority doesn't need applause. There will be moments when you feel alone in this. Moments when walking away costs more than staying used to. Moments when silence feels heavy. That's normal. Growth always creates distance before it creates alignment. The wrong people fall away first. The right ones arrive later, or rise to meet you. Let that process happen. You are not here to be endlessly understood. You are here to be intact. You are not here to be endlessly patient. You are here to be precise. You are not here to be loved at the cost of yourself. You are here to love without disappearing. So remember this when doubt creeps in. Every boundary you hold is a declaration. Every time you choose silence over explanation, you reclaim ground. Every time you walk away without drama, you reinforce your position. This is not cruelty. This is command. And command is calm. It is disciplined. It is unreactive. You don't threaten. You don't chase. You don't beg to be seen. You allow, or you withdraw. That's it. So if someone tells you you've changed, agree. If they say you're colder, smile. If they say you're harder to reach, nod. Because what they're really saying is this: you are no longer easy to use. And that was always the goal. You didn't lose love. You refined it. You didn't lose warmth. You protected it. You didn't lose yourself. You finally chose yourself. And from this moment on, you don't move emotionally. You move deliberately. That is not the end. That is the beginning.